They say the forest has a way of swallowing you whole, of making you feel small and insignificant beneath its towering trees. Whispering Pine Trail was supposed to be my escape, a chance to get away from the noise of the world and clear my head. I wanted silence, solitude. I wasn't expecting to meet anyone that morning, much less someone who would make me question everything about what I thought I knew. It started at the trailhead. I was tightening the straps of my backpack when I noticed him. He was just standing there, watching. Mid to late 30s, wiry frame, faded jacket. He didn't look dangerous, just off. He didn't smile when our eyes met, though he nodded in that casual way hikers do when they see each other. "Heading out alone?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, forcing a polite smile as I adjusted my pack. I tried to keep my tone casual, light. Most hikers are friendly, after all, and I didn't want to come off as rude. "Brave," he said, almost too quietly for me to hear. There was something about the way he said it, how the word lingered in the air. He didn't move toward me, didn't block my path, but I still felt an instinctual urge to leave. "Be careful out there," he added, the corners of his mouth twitching like he knew a secret I didn't. I nodded and walked past him, my boots crunching against the gravel as I put as much distance between us as I could. I didn't look back. For the first hour, the hike was everything I'd hoped for. The forest was beautiful, its towering pines casting a greenish light through the thick canopy. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles, and the trail ahead seemed to stretch endlessly into peace and quiet. With every step, I felt myself relax, the tension from the morning slowly unwinding. Whatever strange vibes I'd felt at the trailhead were probably just my own paranoia. I stopped at a small clearing to take a break, pulling out a granola bar and my water bottle. The sunlight filtered through the trees, dappling the ground in golden patches. I sat on a fallen log, letting the quiet of the forest settle over me. It was the kind of stillness I'd been craving, the kind that made you feel like the world had paused just for you. But then, as I was packing up to continue, I noticed something. A footprint in the dirt, fresh and unmistakable. It wasn't mine. My stomach tightened as I scanned the area, but there was no one in sight. I told myself it was just another hiker, someone who'd passed through earlier. Still, the unease crept back in, a faint prickle at the back of my neck. I kept walking, trying to shake the feeling. The trail wound deeper into the woods, the trees growing denser, their branches knitting together to block out the sun. The air felt cooler here, heavier. I focused on the rhythm of my steps, the crunch of dirt and leaves beneath my boots. But every so often, I'd hear something, a rustle in the underbrush, the snap of a twig. I'd stop, holding my breath, but the forest always seemed still when I looked around. I was rounding a bend in the trail when I caught a glimpse of movement through the trees. My heart leaped into my throat as I froze, my eyes locking onto the figure in the distance. It was him. He was standing just off the trail, partially obscured by the shadows of the pines. He wasn't moving, just watching. My pulse quickened as I tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe he'd decided to hike the same trail. But something about the way he stood there, so still, so deliberate, made my skin crawl. I forced myself to keep walking, my steps faster now, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The trail felt different as I moved deeper into the woods, less familiar. The trees seemed closer, their trunks pressing in on either side. I tried to focus on the path ahead, but my mind kept drifting back to him. Why was he here? Was he following me? Or was I just imagining things? I stopped again to catch my breath, leaning against a tree as I pulled out my map. The trail was supposed to be straightforward, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was going in circles. As I studied the map, I heard it, a faint whisper, carried on the breeze. My head snapped up, my heart pounding. The sound was so soft, so fleeting, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. But then it came again, clearer this time. words I couldn't quite make out, spoken in a low, almost conversational tone. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees around me. The forest was still, the only movement the sway of branches in the wind. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. The whisper stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing against my ears like a physical weight. I didn't wait to hear it again. I shoved the map back into my pack and started walking, my pace quickening with every step. The trail twisted and turned, the trees growing darker and more oppressive. The whispers followed me, faint but persistent, like a voice just out of reach. And then I saw him again, closer this time. He was standing in the middle of the trail, his face partially obscured by shadow. My breath caught as I stopped, my hand tightening around the flashlight in my pack. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the trees. He didn't answer. He just stood there, watching me with that same unreadable expression. I took a step back, my heart racing. He tilted his head slightly, almost like he was amused. And then, without a word, he turned and disappeared into the trees. I didn't think, I just ran. We had been planning the trip for months. 5 of us, me, Mark, Sarah, Jen, and Dave, crammed our schedules together to find a free weekend to escape into the wilderness. Red Hollow Forest had been our pick. Remote enough to feel like an adventure, but not so isolated that we'd be completely off the grid. We were all eager for the break, ready to trade fluorescent lighting for starlit skies. The hike to our campsite was idyllic. The late afternoon sun cast long beams through the trees, and the air was filled with the scent of pine and wildflowers. We laughed and joked as we hauled our gear, feeling invincible, like the forest was ours to conquer. Red Hollow had a reputation for being vast and untamed, but the only warnings we'd heard were about the usual watch out for bears. Keep your food sealed, don't stray too far from the marked trails. The park ranger's advice had been straightforward and almost dismissive, which made us all feel safe, maybe a little cocky. We reached the clearing by dusk, a perfect little spot surrounded by towering trees with a small stream trickling nearby. While Dave and Mark set up the tents, Jen started gathering wood for a fire, and Sarah and I worked on unpacking the food. It all felt so normal, like the quintessential camping trip you'd see in a brochure. None of us had any reason to suspect it would take a turn. The fire was roaring by the time the sun dipped below the horizon, and we sat in a loose circle, passing around a flask and roasting marshmallows. Dave, the self-proclaimed storyteller of the group, leaned in toward the flames with a wicked grin. "All right, who wants to hear a ghost story?" he asked, his voice dripping with exaggerated suspense. "Let me guess," Jen said, rolling her eyes. "Something about a haunted cabin or a killer in the woods?" Dave wagged a finger at her. "Actually, Red Hollow has its own little legend. Want to hear it?" We groaned in unison, but he took that as encouragement. "So," Dave began, lowering his voice, back in the 1930s. There was a massive wildfire that tore through this forest, burned thousands of acres, wiped out entire homesteads. Legend has it, a group of firefighters got trapped up here when the wind shifted. They were never found. Some people say their spirits still haunt the forest, looking for a way out. "Okay, but why would they haunt us?" Sarah asked, laughing nervously. "Well," Dave said with a shrug, "they say if you light a fire in Red Hollow, it might call them. They're drawn to it, see? Still trying to put out the flames, even in death." The fire crackled as his words hung in the air. I rolled my eyes, trying to act unimpressed, but something about the way the shadows danced against the trees made me shiver. Jen tossed a marshmallow at Dave's head, breaking the tension. "Nice try, Dave. I'm not scared." We all laughed, and the night went on. We told more stories, played a few games, and drank until our cheeks were warm and our voices loud. By the time we crawled into our tents, the forest had gone completely still, the kind of silence that feels unnatural. I chalked it up to being far from civilization, nothing to worry about. But then the noises started. I don't know what woke me up at first. Maybe it was the cold or the uncomfortable angle of my sleeping bag. But as I lay there, staring up at the dark fabric of the tent, I heard it. A faint rustling, like something or someone moving through the underbrush. My first thought was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. I reached for my phone, the screen casting a pale glow as I checked the time, 2:13 a.m. I was about to roll over and try to fall back asleep when I heard it again, closer this time. A rhythmic crunch, like footsteps. My heart started to race as I strained to listen, holding my breath. The sound circled the campsite, deliberate and unhurried. I whispered Mark, hoping he was awake. No response. My stomach twisted as I realized how quiet it was outside. Too quiet. Even the usual hum of crickets and distant owls had vanished. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then came the sound that made my blood run cold. Faint, muffled voices. They were low and indistinct, like whispers carried on the wind, but there was something off about them. They didn't sound quite human. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dull orange glow across the clearing. The others' tents were still zipped up, motionless. But just beyond the edge of the firelight, I saw them, shapes moving between the trees. Shadowy figures, their outlines flickering as if distorted by heat waves. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. My logical brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was other campers, or my imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew neither of those explanations fit. The figures moved closer, their forms becoming clearer. They looked human, but wrong. Their features were hazy, their movements unnaturally fluid, like they weren't entirely solid. I ducked back into the tent, my heart pounding. I fumbled for my flashlight, debating whether to wake the others. Then the footsteps started again, heavy and deliberate, circling the tents. The whispers were everywhere now, overlapping and chaotic, filling my head with static. I clamped my hands over my ears, squeezing my eyes shut, but it didn't help. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I waited, every muscle in my body tense, but the forest remained still. I don't know how long I stayed like that before exhaustion finally pulled me under. When I woke up, sunlight was streaming through the fabric of the tent. The others were already up, their voices cheerful as they packed up their gear. I stepped outside, squinting against the bright light. The campsite looked normal, no signs of the night before. "Sleep well?" Mark asked, grinning as he handed me a cup of coffee. I hesitated, the words on the tip of my tongue. But as I looked around at their smiling faces, I stopped myself. They didn't seem shaken or afraid. Maybe it had been a dream, or some kind of waking hallucination brought on by exhaustion. I forced a smile and nodded. Yeah, fine. We hiked back to the trailhead that morning, leaving Red Hollow behind. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that something was watching us, waiting. And sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I still hear the whispers. There were 4 of us, me, Ethan, Lily, and Ben. We'd been best friends since college, and now, years later, we still made time for annual camping trips. This year, Ethan suggested Blackwood Forest. He'd read about it online, a secluded stretch of woods, far from cell towers and noise. The idea was to disconnect completely, to enjoy nature without distractions. The day started normally. We hiked through the forest, under a bright blue sky, the kind of day that makes you feel alive. The path was rugged but scenic, flanked by towering oaks and pines, their branches forming a patchwork canopy overhead. The forest seemed untouched by time, its air thick with the earthy smell of moss and fallen leaves. We joked, swapped stories, and took turns leading the way, the sound of our laughter echoing through the trees. By late afternoon, we found a clearing to set up camp. It was perfect. A flat patch of ground bordered by the forest on one side and a gentle stream on the other. While Ben and Ethan pitched the tents, Lily and I gathered firewood. We wandered a little farther into the woods, the shadows growing longer as the sun dipped lower. That's when we noticed its first weird thing. It was small at first glance, almost insignificant. A ring of mushrooms growing in a perfect circle at the base of a tree. I stopped, staring at it for a moment. "That's odd," I said, crouching down. "Fairy ring," Lily said casually. "It's just fungus." She paused, her smile faltering as her eyes narrowed. "But aren't they supposed to grow in open fields, not in forests?" I shrugged, brushing it off. It was strange, sure, but not unsettling. We continued gathering wood and made our way back to camp, trying to laugh off the oddness of it. As dusk settled, the forest seemed to change. The air grew colder, and the cheerful chirps of birds gave way to an eerie silence. The stream, which had been a comforting background noise, now seemed unnaturally loud, each gurgle echoing like a whisper. We built a fire and sat around it, the warm glow driving back the encroaching darkness. That's when Ethan mentioned the cabin. "Did you see it on the way up here?" he asked, poking at the fire with a stick. I frowned. "Cabin? Yeah," he said. "I thought I saw one through the trees. Looked old, abandoned, kind of creepy, honestly." "I didn't see anything," Ben said, glancing over his shoulder at the woods. "You sure?" Ethan shrugged. "Maybe it was just the shadows. Or I imagined it." We let it drop, but something about the way Ethan said it left a strange tension in the air. The idea of an abandoned cabin, hidden somewhere in the forest, made the trees around us feel closer, the shadows darker. We turned in early, all of us tired from the hike. I crawled into my tent, the warmth of my sleeping bag a welcome comfort against the chill of the night. I drifted off to the sounds of the stream and the crackling fire, my exhaustion pulling me into a deep, dreamless sleep, at least until the knocking woke me up. It was faint at first, almost like it was coming from far away. My eyes snapped open, and for a moment, I couldn't tell if I'd dreamed it. But then it came again, 3 sharp, deliberate knocks. My heart pounded as I sat up, straining to listen. The sound wasn't coming from the direction of our tents. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the forest. "Ethan," I called out quietly, unzipping my tent just enough to peek outside. The campsite was still. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows against the trees. I could see the outline of the other tents, motionless. The knocking came again, louder this time. It echoed through the woods, sending a chill down my spine. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the tent, the beam cutting through the darkness. "Guys, did you hear that?" I said, my voice trembling. One by one, the others emerged from their tents, their faces pale and groggy. "What's going on?" Lily asked, wrapping her arms around herself for warmth. "Listen," I said, pointing toward the forest. The knocking came again, sharper and more insistent. Ben cursed under his breath. "What the hell is that?" "It's probably just a tree branch," Ethan said, though his voice lacked conviction. "A tree branch," Lily snapped. "Are you kidding me? That sounds like it's coming from a door." We stood there, huddled together, listening as the knocking grew louder, more rhythmic. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of the stream. And then we heard it. Footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, crunching against the forest floor. The beam of my flashlight wavered as I swept it across the trees, but there was nothing there. The footsteps circled us, moving just beyond the edge of the light. My pulse quickened as I tried to make sense of it. An animal, a person. Who's there? Ethan called out, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. No answer. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, a voice called out, "Help me." It was faint, barely louder than a whisper, but it was enough to send a jolt of fear through all of us. The voice was distorted, almost like it was coming through water. It didn't sound right. "Don't move," Ben whispered, his eyes wide. "Just stay here." But I couldn't. My legs moved on their own, the flashlight trembling in my hand as I stepped toward the trees. "Wait," Lily hissed, grabbing my arm, but I shook her off. I felt drawn to it, the voice, the sound. It wasn't logical, but something deep in my gut pulled me forward. And then I saw Ita cabin. It was just visible through the trees, its silhouette jagged and wrong. The windows were dark, gaping holes that seemed to watch me as I stepped closer. The voice called out again, louder this time. "Help me." "Don't," Ethan said, grabbing my shoulder and pulling me back. "That's not..." But before he could finish, the knocking started again, louder than ever, coming from the cabin. We ran. I don't remember grabbing my gear. I don't remember how we made it back to the main trail. All I remember is the sound of that voice following us, distorted and pleading, growing fainter as we put more distance between ourselves and the cabin. We never talked about what happened that night. But I know one thing for sure. We weren't alone in Blackwood Forest. And whatever was there, it wanted us to find it.